In January 1918, United States President Woodrow Wilson offered his vision for a utopian future that would result from a victory over the Central Powers. His 14 points included ideas of importance internationally and more specific territorial concerns. His fourth point, reduction of armaments, said that countries should reduce armaments to the point that they would guarantee their security. Wilson took a stand against militarism by claiming that nations should disarm themselves. His hope was to have nations that did not feel threatened and would not be a threat to other nations by having a limited military. Ultimately, he hoped this would prevent another great war. Wilson knew that historically, a large navy demonstrated economic and military power to the rest of the world. In the early 1900s, Great Britain was the undisputed king of naval arms. As an island nation, Great Britain relied on its navy for security and for colonial service. Germany's naval advisor, Alfred von Tirpitz, wanted to show that Germany could also be a major power. To do this, he needed a strong navy. Germany soon started expanding their armament program. Von Tirpitz led Germany and the United Kingdom into what would be known as the Anglo-German arms race, causing tensions to rise as Europe entered World War I. After World War I ended, tensions began to rise between the Allied nations.
When you didn't have the common enemy of Germany to keep the Allies moving in the same direction, there's a tendency in the aftermath of the war to divide. And this was particularly important in World War I because there hadn't been a whole lot of thinking about what they wanted to do after the war. If you asked any one of the Allies up to 1918, what do you want to get out of this war? The answer would have been, we want to win the war. Well, why do you want to win the war? Because we don't want to lose the war. They hadn't really thought about what's the post-war going to look like.
Although Wilson's idea was popular among the masses, the details of disarmament proved difficult to work out. Nations generally agreed that taking a stand against militarism was good, but they could not decide on how exactly to take that stand to please everybody. What resulted was a series of negotiations and treaties limiting all forms of armament. Since the Navy was critical to a nation's defense and offensive capability, one line of treaties tried to establish limits on naval armaments. The major powers of the world, France, Italy, Britain, Japan, and the United States, excluding Germany, met in Washington from November 12, 1921 to February 4, 1922, to discuss the details of limiting naval arms. The result was the Five-Power Treaty, one of 3 treaties resulting from the Washington Naval Conference. The Five-Power Treaty restricted the tons of capital ships each nation could own, giving the United States and Great Britain each a maximum of 525,000 tons of capital ships. The other nations that participated had decreasing tonnage from there, giving Japan 315,000 tons and France and Italy 175,000 tons each. This limitation on battleships caused many battleships in production to be converted into aircraft carriers. The older battleships, already in service, were usually scrapped and broken up in industrial scrapyards. Most of the newer battleships were put into mothballs to be used again if the need ever arose.
Well, Japan came out of the war as one of the victorious allies. It was one of the 5 major powers that sided against the Germans. And as an island nation, like Britain, it thought it needed a navy for defense. It's no different than England in terms of having to have a navy to defend its coastlines. Moreover, in the aftermath of the war and in line with its pre-war imperialistic aggressions in East Asia, it thought it was a great power. Great powers ought to have great toys, and among those toys was a navy.
When word of the treaty reached the home islands of Japan, Japan's chief of naval board, Commander Kato Kanji, was so upset that he said there was already a war brewing between the US and Japan. Japan threatened Britain as well, putting claims on the British naval bases in the Pacific in retaliation for what Japan considered it lost in the treaty. Britain then left the defensive treaty it had with Japan, which would have forced Great Britain to go to war with the United States if Japan attacked the United States. The final outcome of this series of events is that some of Japan's populace view Britain and the United States as enemies. By the late 1920s, people realized that although capital ships were limited in the Five-Power Treaty, other classes of ships were not included. This enabled countries to still have an arms race with other classes of ships. President Calvin Coolidge invited the original five powers back to fix the problem. France and Italy declined the opportunity to participate. The United States, Great Britain, and Japan met in Geneva on June 20th, 1927 to August 4th, 1927 to create limits for the other classes of ships. Japan was still intent on increasing its naval tonnage. They could not agree on details of the conference, and the conference failed. In the next few years, battleship technology advanced rapidly. Some ships that were under construction would be obsolete by the time they were christened into their respective navy. Over this period of time, the general size of ships increased. For example, the battleship Nevada was made in 1916, around the year of the Washington Naval Conference, and the Iowa was made in 1942. The size of the ships was not the only thing that changed. The damage potential of ships was still increasing because there was much more accurate firing due to fire control radar and rangefinders. These advancements caused a larger quantity of shells to hit and deal damage. In 1930, the original parties to the Five-Power Treaty recognized that this technology had advanced to a point where they needed to try to revise the treaty again. Other new technology took advantage of loopholes in the Five-Power Treaty that allowed creative adaptations to cruisers and other ships to make them more powerful than they should have been. For example, you could attach aircraft to a battleship and not have to classify as an aircraft carrier, which had their own restrictions. The United States, Great Britain, and Japan met in London on April 22, 1930 to discuss a revision to the Five-Power Treaty. The resulting London Naval Treaty was put into action, limiting and revising the Washington Naval Treaty, in particular the section on cruisers. The new treaty included a much more clear definition of a cruiser. In response to these new regulations, the United States designed and built the USS Wichita and other advanced cruisers. In 1936, the members of the First London Conference met again to tweak the treaty. When Japan asked to have a section of capital ship tonnage increased, the other powers harshly denied it. So, on January 15, 1936, Japan withdrew from the London Naval Conference, stating that since their request to be on par with England and the US was denied, they would no longer adhere to the limits of their treaty. Quickly afterwards, Japan began rearming itself. This caused a severe problem to the other powers because the treaty only worked if you would have someone to restrain that would otherwise rearm. Since the United States and Great Britain were close allies, there was no point to the treaty anymore. The treaty continued for 3 more years until 1939, when war broke out and the treaty was dismantled. In total, this series of treaties took a stand for 17 years, with the intent of stopping conflict before it even started. While everyone publicly agreed that a treaty was necessary, it proved much more difficult to figure out the details of a treaty that no one really wanted to adhere to in reality.
Countries felt that they needed to be secure before they would disarm. But others argued, no, if you disarm first, then you'll feel secure. It's the old chicken or egg problem, which comes first, and they were never really able to overcome that question. And part of it was related to the fact that the naval power said, sure, let's disarm the armies. They didn't have an army to speak of, okay? The land countries said, well, we need our army, so why don't we just disband or disarm the navies? Why not? They didn't have a navy, okay? So they couldn't agree on their own security arrangements. And the League of Nations, which was also a darling of Woodrow Wilson, even though the United States never joined it, was designed to create collective security for the world, that everybody would be protected by the League of Nations somehow. And if it were protected by the League of Nations, then the other countries would be secure enough to disarm. Well, the League of Nations never really fulfilled its promise.
Changes in technology, diplomatic issues constantly changing, and resistance to the hard truth of disarmament over security made actually crafting a viable agreement for the long term impossible. Ultimately, events took their toll on Wilson's stand on behalf of reduction of armaments to the point of its collapse.